The wind howled across the barren plains of Wyoming territory like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bite of an early winter that promised no mercy. Jebediah Claymore stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, watching the storm clouds gather on the horizon. The year was 1883, and at 35, Jeb had already lived more lifetimes than most men would care to count. His ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of stubborn land on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, a piece of earth as unforgiving as the man who had left it to him. His father, dead these past 3 years, had believed that land was the only thing in this world that wouldn't betray a man. Jeb had come to understand the wisdom in those words, though it was a wisdom born of bitter experience. The townspeople called him the Hermit of Stone Creek Ranch, when they bothered to speak of him at all. He rode into Cedar Falls once a month for supplies, conducting his business with few words and fewer smiles. The general store owner, Mrs. Hutchinson, had long since given up trying to engage him in conversation about the weather or the latest town gossip. The saloon girls no longer bothered to catch his eye when he passed by. Even the pastor had stopped inviting him to Sunday services. Jeb preferred it this way. Solitude was a companion that asked for nothing and took less. His days were filled with the honest work of tending to his small herd of cattle, mending fences that the winter winds seemed determined to destroy, and maintaining the ranch house that creaked and groaned with every gust. The nights he spent by the fireplace, reading the few books his mother had left behind before she'd run off when he was barely 7 years old. The storm arrived with the setting sun, bringing with it a mixture of sleet and freezing rain that turned the world into a crystalline prison. Jeb had just finished securing the barn and was making his way back to the house when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was barely audible above the wind, a weak, desperate pounding that seemed to be coming from his front door. Jeb froze, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. No one came to Stone Creek Ranch, especially not in weather like this. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the road from town was treacherous even in good conditions. The pounding came again, weaker this time, followed by what might have been a cry. Against his better judgment, Jeb quickened his pace, his boots crunching through the forming ice. As he rounded the corner of the house, he saw a figure collapsed on his porch steps. It was a woman. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair plastered to her head by the freezing rain. Her dress, once what might have been a respectable traveling outfit, was torn and muddied. But it was what she clutched to her chest that made Jeb's breath catch, a bundle wrapped in what appeared to be a wool blanket, from which emerged the thin wail of an infant. "Please," she whispered as Jeb approached, her lips blue with cold. "Please help us." Then her eyes rolled back, and she slumped forward, unconscious. For a moment, Jeb stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to leave her there, to go inside and bar the door against this intrusion. He didn't need complications. He didn't need anyone. But the baby's cry cut through his resolve like a knife through butter, and before he could think better of it, he was kneeling beside the woman, checking for signs of life. Her pulse was weak but steady. The baby, thank God, seemed relatively unharmed, though its cries were becoming more insistent. Jeb looked around wildly, as if expecting someone to appear and take this burden from him. But there was only the storm and the empty plains, with a curse that would have made his father proud. Jeb carefully lifted the woman into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body trembling even in unconsciousness. He managed to get the door open and carried her inside, laying her on the rug before the fireplace. The baby continued to cry as Jeb added wood to the dying embers, coaxing the flames back to life. In the growing light, he could better see the woman's condition. Her hands were raw and bleeding, as if she'd been walking for miles. Her boots, city boots, completely unsuitable for the terrain, were worn through at the soles. But it was her face that struck him most. Even beneath the dirt and exhaustion, there was a refinement to her features that spoke of a different life, a different world. What was a woman like this doing out here, alone and desperate? The baby's cries grew more urgent, and Jeb realized with growing panic that he had no idea what to do with an infant. He'd helped birth calves and foals, but this was entirely different. Tentatively, he reached for the bundle, carefully unwrapping the blanket to reveal a tiny face, red with cold and anger. "Hush now," he said awkwardly, his voice rough from disuse. "Your mama will wake soon." As if in response to his words, the woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. Green eyes. Jeb noticed. Like spring grass after rain. For a moment, she stared at him in confusion and fear. "My baby," she whispered, struggling to sit up. "The child's safe," Jeb said, carefully handing her the bundle. "You're at Stone Creek Ranch, about 10 miles outside Cedar Falls." She clutched the baby to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God," she whispered. "Thank God." As she rocked the infant, Jeb busied himself with practical matters. He heated water on the stove and found some of the dried beef and hardtack he kept for emergencies. The woman would need food, and probably the baby too, though he had no milk to offer. When he returned with a cup of hot water mixed with a little sugar, the best he could manage, the woman had managed to quiet the baby. She looked up at him with those green eyes, and he saw the moment she truly took in her surroundings, the sparse furnishings, the bachelor's neglect, the obvious absence of any feminine touch. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice stronger now. "I didn't mean to impose. I was trying to reach Cedar Falls, but the storm—" "Storm's not letting up any time soon," Jeb said gruffly, handing her the cup. "You'll have to stay the night." She took the cup with trembling hands, and as she did, a tear escaped her eye and fell onto the wooden floor. In the firelight, it seemed to leave a mark on the old boards, though Jeb knew that was just his imagination. "My name is Evelyn," she said softly. "Evelyn Monroe. And this is James." Jeb nodded but didn't offer his own name. He wasn't ready for that level of familiarity. Instead, he retreated to the kitchen, putting together a simple meal of cornbread and beans. As he worked, he could hear her soft voice, singing a lullaby to the baby. The sound was foreign in his home, like birdsong in a cave. When he returned with the food, Evelyn had managed to remove her ruined boots and was holding her feet toward the fire. He could see the blisters and cuts, the price of her desperate journey. "Eat," he said simply, setting the plate beside her. She looked at the humble fare as if it were a feast. "Thank you," she whispered. And then, as if suddenly remembering her manners, "I don't even know your name." "Jeb," he said after a long pause. "Jeb Claymore." "Mr. Claymore," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Just Jeb, and you don't need to explain anything. Come morning, I'll take you to town." But even as he said it, looking at her exhausted face and the infant sleeping in her arms, he wondered if morning would bring answers or only more questions. The mark of her tear on his floor seemed to pulse in the firelight, a small reminder that his carefully ordered world had just been disrupted by something as simple and devastating as a woman's tears. As the storm raged outside, Jeb retreated to his chair by the window, maintaining a careful distance from his unexpected guests. But his eyes kept returning to them, to the way Evelyn held her child as if he were the most precious thing in the world, to the gentle way she hummed even through her exhaustion, to the way the firelight caught in her dark hair. For the first time in years, Jeb Claymore's house felt less like a fortress and more like what it truly was, a shelter from the storm. And as the night deepened and the wind howled its lonely song, he found himself wondering if perhaps his father had been wrong. Perhaps it wasn't just land that could be trusted. Perhaps, sometimes, a stranger's tears on your doorstep could mark the beginning of something else entirely. But that was a dangerous thought, and Jeb pushed it away. Come morning, he would take her to town. Come morning, his life would return to its careful solitude. Come morning, everything would be as it was. Or so he told himself, as Evelyn Monroe and her child slept by his fire, and the storm wrote its own story across the Wyoming plains. The morning came wrapped in a thick blanket of snow, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost gentle. Jeb had spent the night in his chair, dozing fitfully, starting awake each time the baby cried or Evelyn stirred. Now, as pale sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows, he found her sitting up, cradling young James and staring into the dying embers of the fire. "The storm's past," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "I can take you to town now." She turned to look at him, and in the morning light, he could see the bruises on her face that the darkness had hidden, a faded yellow-green mark along her jaw, another darker one near her temple, signs of violence that had healed but left their story written on her skin. She began, then stopped, looking down at her son. "I suppose I should tell you the truth. You've been kind, and you deserve that much." Jeb wanted to tell her that he deserved nothing, required nothing, but something in her voice held him silent. He added wood to the fire instead, giving her time. "My husband died 6 months ago," she said finally. "Samuel Monroe. He was not a kind man. Mr. Claymore, when he drank, which was often, he would." She touched the bruise on her jaw unconsciously. "But he was my husband, and I endured it. For better or worse, as the vows say." The baby fussed, and she adjusted him in her arms, her movements gentle despite the harsh story she was telling. "When he died, a fight in a saloon, they said, I thought perhaps things would improve, but his family, his brothers especially, they blamed me, said I'd driven him to drink with my city ways and uppity notions. They wanted the farm, you see, and with Samuel gone and me just a woman." She laughed bitterly. "They made it clear I wasn't welcome." Jeb remained silent, but his jaw tightened. He'd known men like that, men who used their fists instead of their words, who saw women as property to be managed rather than people to be cherished. "I had nowhere to go." Evelyn continued, "My own family disowned me when I married Samuel against their wishes. But then I saw an advertisement in a newspaper. A man in Cedar Falls seeking a bride. His letters were so kind, so full of promises. He sent money for the journey, said he had a good home waiting, that he'd care for James as his own." She pulled a bundle of letters from her coat pocket, water-stained but carefully preserved. "Thomas Hartwell. He called himself a successful merchant. He said, lonely after his wife's passing, wanting a family again." The morning light caught the tears gathering in her eyes. "I was a fool to believe it. When I arrived in Cedar Falls yesterday, I asked after him. No one had heard of any Thomas Hartwell. The address he'd given didn't exist. The whole thing was—" She stopped, unable to continue. "A lie." Jeb finished quietly. "You're not the first, won't be the last. Men advertise for brides, take their money or worse, then disappear." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I spent my last coin on lodging, but the proprietor wouldn't let me stay once he saw I had a baby and no husband. Said he ran a respectable establishment. I tried to find work, any work, but—" She gestured helplessly at her city clothes, her soft hands. "I don't even know how to milk a cow. So you started walking." Jeb said, "I heard someone mention there were ranches outside town. I thought perhaps—I don't know what I thought, that someone might need a cook or a seamstress. That Christian charity might mean something out here." She laughed again, the sound like broken glass. "The storm caught me 3 miles from town. I kept walking because stopping meant freezing. When I saw your light—" She looked up at him then, and the gratitude in her eyes made him deeply uncomfortable. "You saved our lives, Mr. Claymore. I don't know how to repay that." "Don't need repayment," Jeb said roughly, turning away. "Just doing what anyone would." "No," she said softly. "Not anyone. Not in my experience." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Jeb could hear his father's voice in his head, warning him about complications, about women who told sad stories, about the danger of getting involved. But he could also remember his mother's tears the night she left, could remember being 7 years old and watching from his bedroom window as she climbed into a stranger's wagon and disappeared into the darkness. "You can't go to town," he heard himself say. "Not in this weather, not with a baby, not to people who've already turned you away. Evelyn's head snapped up. I couldn't impose. You'll work for your keep, he said quickly, before he could change his mind. Can you cook? Yes, simple things. Can you mend? Of course. Then you'll stay until the weather clears and you can find proper arrangements. He kept his voice businesslike, as if he were hiring a ranch hand. There's a small room off the kitchen. Used to be the housekeeper's, back when my mother... He stopped. It's yours if you want it. She stared at him as if he'd offered her a palace. Mr. Claymore, I don't know what to say. Nothing to say. I need help around here anyway. It was a lie, and they both knew it. His house might be neglected, but he'd managed fine on his own for years. I'll move your things to the room. You should rest, and the baby needs proper food. I'll ride to the Svensson place later, see if they can spare some milk. As he turned to go, she called after him. Why? He paused in the doorway. Why what? Why are you helping us? You don't know me. For all you know, everything I've told you could be a lie. Jeb considered the question. Why was he helping her? Was it the tears that had fallen on his porch? The baby's cries that had reminded him of vulnerability in a harsh world? Or was it something in her eyes? A determination despite desperation that spoke to something long buried in his own heart? My mother left when I was young, he said finally, not turning around. Left in the night like she was escaping prison. Maybe she was. My father was a hard man. Harder than your Samuel, probably. Used to wonder if someone had helped her, wherever she went, if someone had shown her kindness. He cleared his throat. Besides, that baby needs a chance. Not his fault his mother trusted the wrong man. When he finally turned, Evelyn was crying again, silent tears that tracked down her bruised face. But she was also smiling, just slightly. Thank you, she whispered. Jeb nodded curtly and escaped to the barn, where he spent longer than necessary checking on the horses. His hands shook as he worked, and he realized with something like fear that his carefully ordered world had just shifted on its axis. When he returned to the house with fresh straw for bedding, he found Evelyn in the kitchen. She'd managed to clean herself up using the water he'd left, and though her dress was still travel-worn, she looked more composed. James was sleeping in a makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from a wooden crate and some blankets. I thought I'd start earning my keep, she said, gesturing to the stove where something was simmering. It's just porridge, but I found some preserved berries in your pantry. The kitchen smelled of cooking food and wood smoke, a combination that brought back memories Jeb had thought long buried. His mother had made porridge on cold mornings, humming while she worked. It smells good, he admitted grudgingly. They ate in silence, but it wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Evelyn had a way of making quiet feel natural rather than awkward. When James woke, she fed him small spoonfuls of porridge thinned with water, cooing to him softly. How old is he? Jeb asked, surprising himself. 4 months. He was born just before Samuel. She trailed off. He's a good baby. Hardly ever cries, except when he's hungry or cold. His father never saw him. He saw him. Her voice went flat. Said he looked too much like my family, too delicate, not like a proper Monroe. Jeb's hands tightened on his coffee cup. He'd known men who could look at their own flesh and blood and find fault. Men so twisted by their own anger that even innocence became something to despise. The day passed strangely. Jeb went about his usual chores, but he was constantly aware of the presence in his house. He could hear Evelyn moving around, cleaning things he hadn't even noticed were dirty. When he came in for lunch, she had soup waiting and bread that was slightly burned, but still better than his usual fare. I'm sorry about the bread, she said anxiously. Your stove cooks differently than I'm used to. It's fine, he said, and meant it. Haven't had fresh bread in months. As afternoon wore on, the weather worsened again. The trip to the Svensson farm would have to wait. Jeb found himself inside more than usual, making repairs he'd been putting off, organizing tools that didn't need organizing. Evelyn worked quietly, efficiently. She mended a pile of his clothes without being asked. her needle flying through the fabric with practiced ease. When James slept, she cleaned. When he was awake, she carried him while she worked, talking to him softly about everything and nothing. "You're good with him," Jeb observed, watching her calm the baby after a crying spell. "He's all I have left," she said simply. "My parents wanted me to give him up when Samuel died. Said a woman alone couldn't raise a child properly. But I couldn't. He's mine." The fierce protectiveness in her voice stirred something in Jeb. He'd seen that same intensity in mother animals defending their young. But in humans, it seemed rarer. As evening approached, they fell into a domestic rhythm that should have felt foreign, but didn't. Evelyn prepared dinner while Jeb tended the fire. They ate together, James sleeping between them in his makeshift cradle. The wind howled outside, but inside, there was warmth and light. "I should tell you," Evelyn said as she cleared the dishes. "People will talk. A woman staying with a man who isn't her husband. People always talk," Jeb replied. "Let them." She studied him carefully. "It doesn't bother you? Your reputation?" He almost laughed. "What reputation? I'm already the hermit of Stone Creek Ranch. Can't fall much further in town opinion." "Still," she persisted, "I don't want to bring shame on your household. Perhaps I could say I'm your cousin, or you'll say nothing." Jeb interrupted. "You're working for room and board. That's the truth, and it's enough." She nodded, but he could see the worry in her eyes. She'd already been cast out once for failing to meet society's expectations. The fear of it happening again was written in every careful movement, every anxious glance. That night, as Jeb showed her to the small room off the kitchen, she paused in the doorway. "Mr. Claymore, Jeb, I need you to know something." He waited. "I'm not looking for another husband. I'm not trying to trap you or manipulate you. I just need a safe place until I can find my feet. I'll work hard. I'll earn my keep. And when the time comes, James and I will move on." The words should have reassured him. Instead, they left him feeling oddly unsettled. "The room's yours as long as you need it," he said gruffly. As he walked back to his own room, he passed the spot where she'd collapsed the night before. In the lamplight, he could swear he still saw the mark where her tears had fallen, a darker spot on the old wood that seemed to pulse with its own life. He shook his head at his own fancy and retired for the night. But sleep was long in coming, and when it did, his dreams were full of tears and bruises and a baby's cry that sounded like hope in the darkness. The rumors reached town within a week, carried on the wind like tumbleweeds across the prairie. Jeb had ridden to the Svensson farm for milk, and old Henrik Svensson, never one to miss an opportunity for gossip, had noticed the extra portion. "Baby at your place, Jeb?" Henrik had asked. His weathered face creased with curiosity. Jeb had simply nodded, paid for the milk, and left. But that was enough. By the time he reached Cedar Falls for his monthly supplies, the whole town was buzzing. Mrs. Hutchinson at the general store was the first to probe directly. "Heard you've taken in a boarder," she said, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles as she measured out flour. "Hired a housekeeper," Jeb corrected tersely. "A young woman, they say, with a baby." The disapproval in her voice was thick as molasses. "That's right, Mrs." Hutchinson's mouth pursed like she'd bitten into a lemon. "Well, I never thought I'd see the day when Jeb Claymore would, well..." She didn't finish, but her meaning was clear. Jeb took his supplies and left without another word, but he could feel the eyes on him as he loaded his wagon. The whispers followed him down Main Street like shadows. The worst came 3 weeks after Evelyn's arrival. Jeb had just returned from checking the cattle when he saw the buggy in front of his house. His stomach tightened as he recognized it. Reverend Josiah Blackwood's pristine black carriage, complete with the man himself standing on the porch. Evelyn answered the door. James balanced on her hip, even from a distance. Jeb could see her shoulders tense. "Reverend," she said politely, "how may I help you?" "Mrs." The Reverend let the question hang. "Monroe, Evelyn Monroe. Ah, yes, the widow." The word dripped with skepticism. "I've come to speak with Mr. Claymore, about the situation here." Jeb dismounted and approached, his boots heavy on the frozen ground. "Reverend," he acknowledged curtly. "Jebediah." The Reverend's thin face was grave. "Might we speak privately?" "Whatever you have to say, you can say here." The Reverend's eyes flicked to Evelyn, then back to Jeb. "Very well. I've come on behalf of the town's moral committee. There are concerns about the arrangement here." "What arrangement?" Jeb's voice was flat. "An unmarried woman living with an unmarried man. Surely you can see how inappropriate." "Mrs. Monroe is my employee," Jeb interrupted. "She keeps house and cooks in exchange for room and board. Nothing inappropriate about honest work." "Be that as it may," the Reverend pressed on, "the appearance of impropriety can be just as damaging as the act itself, for the sake of the community's moral fabric." The community's moral fabric didn't seem concerned when Mrs. Monroe was turned away from town lodgings with a baby in her arms. Jeb said quietly, "Didn't see any Christian charity then." The Reverend's face flushed. "That's hardly the same, isn't it?" Jeb stepped forward, and the Reverend instinctively stepped back. "Woman and child needed help. I provided it. If that offends your moral sensibilities, perhaps you should examine those sensibilities more closely." "Mr. Claymore." Evelyn spoke up softly. "I don't want to cause trouble. If it would be better—" "You'll stay," Jeb said firmly, not looking at her. "Reverend, I believe you know the way back to town." Reverend Blackwood drew himself up to his full height, which still left him looking up at Jeb. "This isn't over, Mr. Claymore. The decent folks of Cedar Falls won't stand for this flouting of propriety. Then the decent folks of Cedar Falls can mind their own business," Jeb replied. "Good day, Reverend." The Reverend left in a huff of righteous indignation, his buggy kicking up dust as it rattled down the road. Jeb watched him go, then turned to find Evelyn still standing in the doorway, her face pale. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I've brought shame to your house." "You've brought nothing but honest work and decent company," Jeb said gruffly. "Let them talk." But that night, after dinner, Evelyn was quieter than usual. She put James to bed early and sat by the fire, mending one of Jeb's shirts with mechanical precision. Jeb tried to read, but found himself watching her instead. The way the firelight caught in her hair, the graceful movement of her hands, the worry line between her brows. "You're thinking of leaving," he said suddenly. She looked up, startled. "How did you—" "Same look my mother had, night before she left." Evelyn set down her sewing. "I won't be the cause of your ruin in this town. You've been kind, kinder than anyone has a right to expect. But I won't repay that by destroying your reputation." "My reputation," Jeb repeated, and surprised himself by laughing. It was a rusty sound, unused. "Mrs. Monroe, Evelyn, I haven't given a damn about my reputation since I came back from the war missing half my soul and all my illusions." She studied him in the firelight. "You were in the war?" 3 years. Saw things that would make the Reverend's moral concerns seem like children's games." He stared into the fire. "Came back to find my father harder than ever and my mother gone. Inherited this land and figured it was as good a place as any to be alone. But you're not alone now," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind outside. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "I was going to leave, pack up James and slip out before dawn. Like—" she paused. "Like your mother did." "I know. But I can't." She looked at him directly then, her green eyes fierce. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, though that's true, but because running feels like letting them win. All of them, my husband's family, the town, everyone who thinks a woman alone is either pitiful or dangerous. So stay," Jeb said simply. "Stay and let them talk themselves hoarse. It could get worse. The Reverend won't let this go. Probably not. They could make trouble for your business, stop buying your cattle, refuse to sell you supplies." Maybe. She shook her head in frustration. Why aren't you worried about this? Jeb considered the question. Why wasn't he worried? He'd spent years building walls around himself, keeping the world at arm's length. Now those walls were crumbling, and he found he didn't mind as much as he'd expected. Spent too many years worrying what others thought, he said finally. My father worried about reputation, about being respected, made him mean, made him drive my mother away. I won't be that man. Evelyn picked up her sewing again, but her hands trembled slightly. I've never known a man like you. Jeb Claymore. Nothing special about me? That's where you're wrong. She smiled then. The first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, made her look younger despite the lingering bruises. You're the first man I've met who does the right thing without expecting anything in return. Jeb felt heat rise in his face and stood abruptly. It's late. I'll check the stock before bed. But as he headed for the door, Evelyn called after him. Jeb, thank you for standing up to the Reverend. For everything. He nodded without turning and escaped into the cold night air. The barn was a refuge, familiar and uncomplicated. The horses nickered softly as he entered, and he spent longer than necessary checking their feed and water. When he finally returned to the house, the main room was dark except for the banked fire, but there was a light coming from the kitchen. He found Evelyn there, heating milk for James, who was fussing in her arms. Sorry if he woke you, she said. Wasn't asleep. Jeb hesitated, then sat at the kitchen table. My mother used to do that. Heat milk in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep. Did it help? Sometimes. Mostly, I think it was just her being there that helped. Evelyn tested the milk's temperature and settled into the chair across from him, cradling James as he ate. Tell me about her. Your mother. Not much to tell. She was young when she married my father. Too young. Came from back east. Thought she was getting adventure. Got a hard man and a harder life instead. Do you know where she went? No. Father burned her letters. Anything that might have said where she was going. Said if she wanted to leave, she could disappear completely. That must have been hard. For a little boy? Jeb shrugged. Learned to take care of myself. Everyone needs taking care of sometimes. Evelyn said gently. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Two damaged souls finding shelter in an unexpected place. James finished his milk and settled back into sleep. Evelyn stood to take him back to bed, but paused beside Jeb's chair. Your mother was wrong to leave you, she said quietly. Whatever her reasons, she was wrong to leave a child behind. But Jeb, I'm glad she had somewhere to run to. Everyone should have that. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the cooling stove. He sat there for a long time, thinking about mothers who left and women who stayed, about reputation and righteousness, about the strange warmth that had taken up residence in his chest. The next morning brought fresh snow and a new complication. Evelyn was hanging laundry when she suddenly gasped and dropped the shirt she was holding. Following her gaze, Jeb saw a rider approaching, a woman on a bay mare, riding with the confidence of someone born to the saddle. Who is that? Evelyn asked, a note of anxiety in her voice. Jeb squinted against the sun's glare on the snow. Margaret Thornton, owns the Double Bar Ranch to the south. Good woman, tough as leather and twice as honest. Margaret Thornton dismounted with easy grace despite her 50-odd years. She was a handsome woman, weathered by sun and wind, wearing men's trousers and a coat that had seen better decades. Jeb, she said by way of greeting, then turned her sharp gaze on Evelyn. And you must be the widow causing such a stir in town. Evelyn's chin lifted. Evelyn Monroe, ma'am. Margaret Thornton. No ma'am necessary. Makes me feel like my mother-in-law. And that's not a comparison I welcome. She studied Evelyn with frank assessment. Prettier than the gossips said. Younger, too. They're saying Jeb's taken up with a dance hall girl. I've never... Evelyn began hotly. Course you haven't. Got too much steel in your spine for that life. Margaret turned to Jeb. Came to warn you. Reverend's stirring up more than just talk. He's got some of the town council listening. There's talk of ordinances, laws about moral turpitude and such. Let them pass their laws, Jeb said. Also came to offer the lady work. Margaret continued. My cook up and married last month. Could use someone who knows her way around a kitchen. Proper employment, room and board included, would quiet some of the talk. Jeb felt something cold settle in his stomach. It was a good offer. A respectable solution. Evelyn would be safe at the double bar, working for a woman with an impeccable reputation. That's kind of you, Evelyn said carefully. Very generous. Practical, Margaret corrected. I need a cook. You need respectable employment. But I'll warn you, I run a cattle ranch, not a nursery. Hard work, long hours, and rough company when the hands are in. I'm not afraid of hard work. Didn't think you were. Margaret glanced between them, a knowing look in her eyes. I'll give you a few days to consider, but don't wait too long. Winter's coming on, and travel will only get harder. After Margaret left, Evelyn was quiet. She finished hanging the laundry, prepared lunch, tended to James, all without saying more than necessary. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, as evening approached and she served a simple dinner of stew and cornbread, Jeb couldn't stand it anymore. It's a good offer, he said. Yes, Margaret's fair. She'll treat you well. I'm sure she will. James would be safe there. Evelyn set down her spoon carefully. Are you trying to convince me or yourself? The question hung in the air between them. Jeb found he couldn't answer it. The thought of the house empty again, of eating alone, of no one there when he came in from the cold. It sat like a stone in his chest. I don't want to go, Evelyn said quietly. But maybe I should, for your sake. To hell with my sake, Jeb said roughly. What do you want? She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his heart race like a spooked horse. I want to stay, she whispered. God help me, I want to stay. The admission seemed to surprise her as much as him. She stood abruptly, busying herself with clearing dishes. But Jeb reached out and caught her wrist gently, the first time he'd purposely touched her since carrying her in from the storm. Then stay, he said. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. The town. We'll talk regardless. Stay because you want to. Not for James, not for safety, not for work. Stay because... He struggled for words. Because this feels right. Does it? She asked. Feel right? First thing that has in years. She turned her hand in his, palm to palm, and squeezed gently before pulling away. All right, I'll stay, and let tomorrow take care of itself. That night, Jeb lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of his house, the creak of settling wood, the wind in the eaves, and now the new sounds of Evelyn moving quietly in her room, humming to James. He thought about Margaret's offer, about the Reverend's threats, about the complications that seemed to grow by the day. But mostly he thought about Evelyn's hand in his, warm and real, and the words she'd spoken. I want to stay, for the first time since his mother left, since the war, since inheriting this lonely patch of earth. Jeb Claymore allowed himself to want something beyond mere survival, and that wanting, terrifying as it was, felt like coming alive. The first lesson was with the rifle. Jeb had noticed how Evelyn startled at unexpected sounds, a lifetime of flinching, he suspected, from her late husband's sudden rages. If she was going to stay on a ranch at the edge of civilization, she needed to know how to protect herself. Hold it steady against your shoulder, he instructed, standing behind her in the crisp December morning. Like this. He reached around to adjust her grip, and for a moment they were close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd made from dried flowers found in his mother's old trunk. She'd been transforming his house bit by bit, small touches that made it feel less like a fortress and more like a home. Breathe out slowly and squeeze the trigger between heartbeats. he continued, stepping back to a safer distance. The shot went wide, startling a crow from its perch on the fence post. Evelyn laughed, a sound that had become more frequent in the weeks since Margaret Thornton's visit. "I'm terrible at this," she said, but she was already resetting her stance, determined to try again. "You're learning," Jeb corrected. "Took me months to hit anything when my father first taught me." This time her shot clipped the edge of the target, an old grain sack stuffed with straw. She whooped with delight, then immediately looked embarrassed by her enthusiasm. "That's good," Jeb said, unable to suppress a small smile. "Remember that feeling. Confidence makes for better aim than fear ever will." They practiced until her arms shook from holding the heavy rifle, when they finally headed back to the house. James was awake in his cradle by the kitchen window, gurgling at dust motes dancing in the winter sunlight. "He's growing fast," Jeb observed, watching Evelyn scoop up her son. "Too fast," she agreed, pressing a kiss to the baby's head. "Soon he'll be walking, then running, then—" She trailed off, her expression momentarily clouded. "Then he'll be learning to shoot rifles and ride horses," Jeb finished. "If you're still here." The words hung between them, an acknowledgement of the temporary nature of their arrangement that neither had voiced in weeks. Evelyn bounced James on her hip, not meeting Jeb's eyes. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about Christmas. It's only 2 weeks away." Jeb grunted. He hadn't celebrated Christmas properly since his mother left. His father had seen no point in it, and Jeb had continued the tradition of treating it like any other day. "I thought perhaps we could have a small celebration," Evelyn continued. "For James, his first Christmas should be—" She paused. "Well, it should be marked somehow." "Don't have much for decorating," Jeb warned. "I'm resourceful," she said, that determined glint in her eye that he'd come to recognize. "You'd be surprised what can be done with pine boughs and flour paste." Over the following days, Jeb found himself drawn into preparations despite himself. He cut a small pine from the back acreage while Evelyn fashioned decorations from scraps of fabric and ribbon she'd found in his mother's trunk. She taught him to make paper chains while James watched from his cradle, and he showed her how to pop corn over the fire for stringing. "My mother used to do this," Evelyn said one evening, carefully threading kernels onto string. "Before she died, Father was different then. Softer. He'd read the Christmas story aloud while we decorated." "What changed him?" Jeb asked, surprised to find he wanted to know. "Grief, I suppose. When Mother died, he couldn't bear anything that reminded him of her. Christmas, most of all." She smiled sadly. "I think that's why I was so eager to marry Samuel. Any escape seemed better than that house full of ghosts. And you escaped into something worse." "Yes." She met his eyes. "But it led me here. So perhaps there was purpose in it after all." The next morning brought fresh complications. Jeb was teaching Evelyn to saddle his gentlest mare when they heard wagon wheels on the frozen road. 2 wagons, heavily loaded, with several riders alongside. "Get to the house," Jeb said quietly, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. But Evelyn stood her ground, shading her eyes against the sun. "I know that wagon. That's Martha Pritchard from town. She runs the boarding house." Indeed, it was Mrs. Pritchard, a stout woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense manner. But what surprised Jeb more was who accompanied her, several women from town, including the banker's wife and the schoolteacher. "Mr. Claymore. Mrs. Pritchard called as the wagons pulled up. "Mrs. Monroe. We've come to call." Jeb and Evelyn exchanged bewildered looks. Social calls at Stone Creek Ranch were unheard of. "Ladies," Evelyn managed, smoothing her work dress nervously. "I'm afraid I'm not prepared for company." "Nonsense," Mrs. Pritchard interrupted, climbing down from the wagon with surprising agility. "We've not come for tea and cakes. We've come to right a wrong." The other women disembarked, and Jeb noticed they all carried bundles and baskets. The schoolteacher, Miss Catherine Wells, A young woman with kind eyes approached Evelyn directly. "We heard what Reverend Blackwood said when he visited," she said, "about Christian charity and moral fabric. It's been bothering us something fierce. The Reverend speaks for himself, not for all of us." The banker's wife, Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, added. She was elegantly dressed even for a ranch visit, but her expression was sincere. "When we heard how you were turned away from town with a baby, that wasn't Christian," Mrs. Pritchard said firmly. "And we've come to make amends. Brought some things for you and the little one. Clothes, blankets, preserves for your pantry." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say. Say you'll forgive us for not coming sooner," Miss Wells said, "and perhaps you'll join us for the Christmas service." "Not Reverend Blackwood's church, the community gathering at the schoolhouse. Everyone's welcome." As the women unloaded their gifts, chattering about babies and recipes and the coming winter, Jeb found himself relegated to the edges of the sudden social whirlwind. He watched Evelyn bloom under their attention, saw her relax in the company of other women in a way she couldn't quite manage with him alone. "Mr. Claymore," Mrs. Pritchard approached him while the others cooed over James. "A word?" He nodded, following her a few steps away from the group. "That's a good woman you've taken in," she said bluntly. "Whatever the circumstances, anyone with eyes can see she's quality." "Yes," he agreed simply. "The Reverend's making noise about propriety, but most of us remember what it's like to need help. I was widowed young myself, with 3 children. If Harold Pritchard hadn't offered me work and a room above his boarding house." She shrugged. "Well, I'd have been in a bad way. We married eventually, but that came later, after respect and friendship." Jeb understood what she was saying, the permission and warning wrapped together. "She works hard," he said. "Earns her keep." "I'm sure she does." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes twinkled. "Just remember, Mr. Claymore, the good women are rarer than gold in these parts, and that one's got steel in her spine along with the sweetness." After the women left, the house felt different, fuller somehow, touched by the outside world in a way it hadn't been in years. Evelyn sorted through the gifts with wonder. Yarn for knitting, fabric for sewing, a small wooden horse for James, jars of preserves and pickles. They didn't have to do this, she kept saying. "People are better than we sometimes think," Jeb said, helping her carry things inside. "Just takes them time to show it." That evening, as they ate dinner from dishes the women had brought, proper china, not Jeb's collection of tin plates, Evelyn was quiet but glowing. "This changes things," she said finally. "How so?" "I'm not a pariah anymore. They accepted me, us." She looked at him across the table. "We could go to the Christmas gathering, together." The idea of attending a social function made Jeb's stomach tighten, but looking at Evelyn's hopeful face, he found himself nodding. "If you want to." Her smile was worth any amount of social discomfort. "I'll make us something special to bring. Mrs. Pritchard mentioned they do a shared meal." The days leading to Christmas passed in a blur of preparation. Evelyn threw herself into cooking and baking with enthusiasm, filling the house with the scents of cinnamon and sage. She altered one of her better dresses with fabric the women had brought, and even convinced Jeb to let her trim his hair. "Hold still," she commanded, scissors snipping carefully around his ears. "You can't go to the gathering looking like a mountain man." "Thought I was a hermit," he grumbled, but he held still. Her fingers in his hair were gentle, careful. When she moved in front of him to check her work, her face was close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. "There," she said softly. "Much better." Their eyes held for a moment too long, and Jeb felt that pull again, stronger than before. Evelyn stepped back quickly, busying herself with putting away the scissors. 2 nights before Christmas, a storm blew in, not the violent blizzard that had brought Evelyn to his door, but a steady snowfall that blanketed the world in white. They worked together to secure the animals, making sure the barn was tight against the wind. "It's beautiful," Evelyn said, pausing to watch the snow fall in the light from the barn door. "Cold is what it is," Jeb replied, but he stopped to watch with her. She shivered, and without thinking, he stepped closer, blocking the wind with his body. She leaned back against him, just slightly, and he let his hands rest on her shoulders. "Jeb," she said quietly. That first night, when I collapsed on your porch, did you think about turning me away?" He considered lying, but found he couldn't. "For a moment." "What changed your mind?" "You cried," he said simply. "Haven't seen a woman's tears since my mother left. Couldn't turn away from them." She turned in his arms then, looking up at him. "And now?" "Now." He touched her face gently, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Now I can't imagine this place without you in it." The kiss was inevitable, soft and careful, full of questions neither was ready to answer. When they pulled apart, Evelyn's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We should go in," she whispered. "James will be waking soon." But that night, as another storm built outside, Jeb heard his bedroom door open. Evelyn stood there in her nightgown, shivering. "The wind," she said. "It's so loud, I keep thinking—" She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. The wind could sound like angry voices, like fists on doors. He understood. "Come here," he said, pulling back the quilts. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the room. They lay together, carefully apart at first, but as the storm raged, she moved closer. He put his arm around her, and she rested her head on his chest. "Is this wrong?" she whispered. "Probably," he admitted. "Do you want to go?" "No." Her hand found his in the darkness, fingers intertwining. "I want to stay." They didn't make love that night. Instead, they held each other while the storm howled outside, finding comfort in simple human closeness. When Jeb woke near dawn, Evelyn was gone, but the pillow still held the scent of her hair. Christmas Eve dawned clear and bright. They loaded the wagon with Evelyn's contributions to the feast, pies and bread and a cake she'd labored over, and made their way to town. James, bundled in new clothes the women had brought, gurgled happily in his mother's arms. The schoolhouse was warm and bright, filled with more people than Jeb had seen in one place since returning from the war. Children ran between the adults' legs, playing tag and shrieking with laughter. Tables groaned under the weight of food, and someone had brought a fiddle. Jeb Claymore, Tom Morrison, the banker, extended his hand. "Good to see you in town for something besides supplies." "Tom," Jeb acknowledged, shaking hands. "Your housekeeper makes a fine cake." Tom continued, nodding toward where Evelyn was being welcomed by the women. "My Adelaide's been singing her praises all week." The careful pause before housekeeper wasn't lost on Jeb, but Tom's tone was friendly enough. As the evening progressed, Jeb found himself relaxing. The townspeople, for the most part, seemed to have accepted Evelyn's presence in his life. There were still some who whispered and pointed, but they were outnumbered by those who smiled and nodded. When the fiddle player struck up a reel, couples began to dance. Jeb watched from his corner, content to observe, until Evelyn appeared at his elbow. "Dance with me," she said. "I don't dance." "Tonight you do." She took his hand, pulling him toward the cleared floor. He was clumsy at first, out of practice and self-conscious, but Evelyn was patient, guiding him through the steps until muscle memory took over. Soon they were moving together, her skirts swirling, both of them laughing at his occasional missteps. When the music slowed to a waltz, she moved closer, her hand warm in his. Around them, other couples danced, but Jeb was aware only of Evelyn, the way she fit against him, the trust in her eyes, the smile that hadn't left her face all evening. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For this, for everything, for giving me a chance at happiness again." He pulled her closer, not caring who might see. "You gave me the same." As they danced, snow began to fall outside the windows, adding magic to an already magical evening. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jeb Claymore felt part of something larger than himself. a community, a partnership, perhaps even a family. The ride home was quiet. James sleeping in his basket, the wagon wheels crunching through fresh snow. When they reached the ranch, Jeb carried the baby inside while Evelyn gathered their empty dishes. In the house, with James settled in his cradle, they stood together by the dying fire. The Christmas tree they'd decorated looked homey in the dim light, paper chains and popcorn strings catching the glow. It was a good day. Evelyn said, "Yes." She turned to him, reaching up to touch his freshly trimmed hair. "You clean up well, Jeb Claymore." "You're not so bad yourself." Evelyn Monroe. This time when they kissed, it was with intent, with promise. And when she took his hand and led him to his room, he didn't question it. They came together with a tenderness born of shared pain and growing trust, finding solace and joy in equal measure. Afterward, as they lay entwined, Evelyn traced patterns on his chest. "No regrets?" he asked. "None," she said firmly. "You? Only that it took so long?" She laughed softly. 3 months isn't so long. Feels like a lifetime?" "Yes," she agreed. "It does." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. Inside, 2 wounded souls found warmth in each other, building something new from the ashes of their pasts. It wasn't conventional, what they had, but it was real, and it was theirs. And for now, that was enough. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday morning in late January, when the snow lay thick on the ground and the sky threatened more. Jeb was in the barn, teaching Evelyn how to properly clean a horse's hooves. When they heard the approaching hoofbeats, "Stay here," Jeb said automatically, his hand moving to his rifle. But Evelyn had already seen the rider through the barn door, and her face had gone white as fresh snow. "Oh, God," she whispered. "It's Matthew." "Who's Matthew?" "My late husband's cousin, Samuel's closest kin." Her voice shook. "He swore at the funeral that I'd pay for Samuel's death." The rider dismounted with deliberate slowness, a tall man with dark hair and the kind of lean build that suggested speed rather than strength. His clothes were travel-worn but of good quality, and he wore his guns low on his hips in the manner of someone who knew how to use them. "Evelyn," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen yard. "I know you're here. Took me some time to track you down, but a woman traveling alone with a baby leaves a trail." Jeb stepped out of the barn, rifle held casually but ready. "This is private property." Matthew Monroe turned his cold gaze on Jeb. "You'd be Claymore, the man who's been harboring my cousin's widow." He said the last word like it tasted bad. "I'm the man who employs Mrs. Monroe as a housekeeper." Jeb said evenly, "State your business or move along. My business is with her." Matthew's eyes flicked back to where Evelyn stood in the barn doorway. "She's got something that belongs to the Monroe family." "I have nothing of yours," Evelyn said, stepping forward despite Jeb's warning gesture. "Samuel left me nothing but bruises and debt. You've got his son." Matthew's voice turned harder. "Monroe blood. That boy should be raised by family, not by his father's killer." "I didn't kill Samuel." Evelyn's voice rose. "He died in a bar fight. You know that. After you drove him to drink with your nagging and your airs." Matthew took a step closer. "Always thought you were too good for him, didn't you? With your books and your proper way of talking." "That's enough," Jeb interjected, moving to place himself between Matthew and Evelyn. "You've said your piece. Now go." Matthew's hand hovered near his gun. "I'm not leaving without the boy. He's Monroe blood, and by rights, he's with his mother." Jeb cut him off. "And that's where he stays. This isn't your concern. Claymore, you made it my concern when you came onto my land making threats." The 2 men faced each other in the cold morning air, tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Finally, Matthew smiled, but it was all teeth and no warmth. "I see how it is. She's got you fooled too, hasn't she? Pretty face, sad story, a baby to tug at your heartstrings." He shook his head. Samuel wrote me about her, how she'd cry and carry on, make him feel like less than a man, drive anyone to violence. Living with that. Evelyn made a small, hurt sound behind Jeb, but he kept his eyes on Matthew. "Get off my land," Jeb said quietly. "Now." "I'll go," Matthew said, backing toward his horse. "But this isn't over. That boy has family who care about his welfare, real family, and we know how to use the law when needed." He mounted his horse with easy grace, then looked down at them both. "Ask her about the money. Claymore, ask her about the $500 that went missing from Samuel's strongbox the night he died. Ask her why she ran so fast and so far." With that, he wheeled his horse and rode off, leaving silence in his wake. Evelyn was trembling when Jeb turned to her. "There was no money," she said before he could ask. "Samuel drank away everything we had. If there had been $500, do you think I would have been walking through a storm with holes in my boots?" "I believe you," Jeb said simply, and watched the tension drain from her shoulders. But later that evening, after James was asleep and they sat by the fire, Evelyn brought it up again. "Matthew won't give up," she said. "The Monroes are like that. They hold grudges like treasures. He'll make trouble. Let him try. You don't understand." She twisted her hands in her lap. "They have connections. Samuel's uncle is a judge 2 counties over. They could claim I'm an unfit mother, that She paused. "That I'm living in sin with a man who isn't my husband." The accusation hung in the air between them. They'd been sharing a bed since Christmas, finding comfort and growing love in each other's arms. But they'd never spoken of the future, of making their arrangement official. They could take James. Evelyn whispered. "The law favors men in custody matters. A male relative with standing in the community versus a widow of questionable morals. That won't happen," Jeb said firmly. "How can you be sure?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Because if need be, I'll make you a widow of unquestionable morals." Evelyn's head snapped up. "Jeb?" He met her eyes steadily. "Marry me. You don't have to. I'm not asking because I have to." He interrupted. "Should have asked weeks ago. Been thinking about it since Christmas. Truth be told, this just makes it urgent." "Jeb Claymore," she said softly. "Are you proposing to me because you want to, or because you think you need to protect me?" He stood and crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it so they were eye level. "Both," he admitted. "I want to protect you. Want to give James a legal father so no Monroe can touch him. But more than that." He took her hands. "I want to wake up beside you every morning knowing you're mine by law and choice. Want to build something here together, not just survive side by side." Tears streamed down her face. "You hardly know me." "I know enough." He squeezed her hands gently. "I know you sing to James when you think I can't hear. Know you've read every book in this house twice. Know you put wildflowers on the kitchen table even in winter because you dry them in the fall. Know you still flinch when voices are raised, but you're getting stronger every day. And I know you," she whispered back. "Know you talk to the horses like they're old friends. Know you can't sleep when the wind sounds like artillery. Know you touch your mother's books like they're sacred. Know you're the gentlest man I've ever met despite trying to seem hard." "So," he asked, "will you marry me, Evelyn Monroe? Make an honest man of me?" "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jeb Claymore." He kissed her then, deep and sure, a promise sealed. When they finally pulled apart, she was smiling despite the worry still lingering in her eyes. "We should do it soon," she said, "before Matthew can make his move. Tomorrow, if the preacher will do it. Not Blackwood, maybe that new minister Miss Wells mentioned. Reverend Harper, yes, I think he'd help us." She touched his face gently. "Are you sure about this? Marriage is forever. I know." He turned his face to kiss her palm. "I'm counting on it." They rode to town the next morning, leaving James with Mrs. Svensson, who'd agreed to watch him without asking questions. The new minister, Reverend Paul Harper, was a young man with kind eyes and a practical manner. "I can perform the ceremony," he said after hearing their request, "but you'll need witnesses." "We'll find them," Jeb said. They did, in the form of Mrs. Pritchard and Miss Wells, both of whom seemed delighted by the turn of events. "About time." "Mrs." Pritchard muttered as they gathered in the small parsonage parlor. "Anyone with eyes could see you two belong together." The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional. But when Jeb slipped his mother's ring onto Evelyn's finger, a thin gold band he'd kept hidden for years, his voice shook with emotion. "With this ring, I thee wed," he said, and meant every word. Evelyn's own voice was steady as she repeated the vows, her green eyes never leaving his face. When Reverend Harper pronounced them man and wife, she rose on her toes to kiss him, not caring about their audience. "Congratulations, Mrs. Claymore," Miss Wells said afterward, and Evelyn's smile could have lit the room. They signed the marriage certificate with flourishes, making it official in the eyes of law and God. Mrs. Pritchard insisted on standing them a wedding lunch at her boarding house, where word of the marriage spread like wildfire. "That'll put a spoke in Matthew Monroe's wheel," Tom Morrison said, stopping by their table to offer congratulations. "Man can't claim custody from a child's legal parents." But Jeb noticed the worry in Evelyn's eyes hadn't entirely faded. As they rode home with James, collected from a beaming Mrs. Svensson, she was quiet. "Regrets already?" he asked gently. "No, never." She shifted James in her arms. "I just keep waiting for something to go wrong. Happiness hasn't been reliable in my experience. Then we'll just have to change your experience," Jeb said. That evening, as Mrs. Jebediah Claymore, Evelyn moved her few possessions into the main bedroom. It felt different, somehow, knowing they were truly married. The intimacy they'd shared before had been stolen moments, sweet but shadowed by uncertainty. Now they came together as husband and wife, and the freedom of it was intoxicating. "I love you," Evelyn whispered in the darkness afterward. "I should have said it before, but I was afraid to jinx it. But I do love you, Jeb." "And I love you," he replied, the words rusty but heartfelt. "Have for a while now." "Since when?" she asked, tracing patterns on his chest. "Since you stood up to Reverend Blackwood that day." "Saw the steel in you then, or maybe since you burned that first loaf of bread and looked so mortified. Or could be since I found you on my porch." He pulled her closer. "Doesn't matter when, just matters that I do." 3 days later, Matthew Monroe returned. This time he brought help, 2 rough-looking men who had the air of hired guns about them. They arrived at midday. When Jeb was out checking the far pastures, Evelyn saw them coming from the kitchen window. Her hands shook as she loaded the rifle Jeb had taught her to use. Then she stood in the doorway, weapon ready but not quite aimed. "That's far enough," she called as they approached. Matthew held up his hands in mock surrender. "Now, cousin, is that any way to greet family? We've just come to talk." "We have nothing to talk about." "Oh, but we do." His smile was sharp. "You see, I've been to town. Heard about your hasty marriage. Very convenient. How quickly you found another man to take you in." "My marriage is none of your concern. It is when you're raising Monroe blood. That boy deserves better than a mother who—" He stopped, his attention caught by movement behind Evelyn. She risked a glance back to see Jeb approaching on horseback, rifle already in hand. Relief flooded through her. "Gentlemen," Jeb said calmly as he dismounted, "I thought I made myself clear about trespassing." "Just paying a social call on my cousin," Matthew said. "Wanted to congratulate her on her marriage, though I have to wonder what kind of man marries a woman so quickly, almost like you had something to hide." "What we have is a marriage certificate and a happy home," Jeb replied, "which is more than you can say." One of Matthew's companions shifted restlessly. "We doing this or not, Monroe?" "Patience, Frank." Matthew never took his eyes off Jeb. "Mr. Claymore, I'm prepared to make you an offer. The boy comes with us, and we forget all about the money Evelyn stole. We even forget about her questionable behavior. She can go on playing house with you, have new babies to replace the one she lost. Everyone wins. Except James, Evelyn said fiercely, who'd be raised by men who think violence is the answer to everything. Better than being raised by a whore and a hermit. Matthew snarled, his polite mask finally slipping. Jeb's rifle swung up, aimed directly at Matthew's chest. You'll apologize to my wife? Now! The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Matthew's hired men reached for their weapons, but froze as Evelyn's rifle centered on the nearest one. I'd listen to him, she said quietly. I might not be the shot he is, but at this range, I don't need to be. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Matthew laughed, low and ugly. You've got some sand. Cousin, I'll give you that. He looked at Jeb. This isn't over. There are legal channels. Courts that might be very interested in a woman who fled the scene of her husband's death with missing money. Try it, Jeb said. We'll be ready. Matthew gestured to his men, and they began backing toward their horses. 6 months, he called as he mounted. That's how long it takes to get a custody hearing arranged. Enjoy your borrowed time. After they'd gone, Evelyn's knees gave out. Jeb caught her, holding her as she shook. He won't stop, she whispered. He'll keep coming until we stop him. Jeb finished, and we will. Together. That night, as they lay in bed with James sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Evelyn was restless. What if he's right? What if the courts? Then we'll face that when it comes, Jeb said. But Evelyn, you're not alone anymore. You've got me and the law and more friends in town than you realize. Matthew Monroe doesn't know what he's up against. She rolled to face him in the darkness. How are you so calm? Because I've got something worth fighting for now, he said simply. Makes all the difference. She kissed him then, pouring all her fear and love and gratitude into the gesture. When morning came, they'd begin preparing for whatever Matthew might bring. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, they were just Jeb and Evelyn Claymore, husband and wife, partners against whatever storms might come. The blizzard struck with a fury that reminded old-timers of the winter of '71, when entire herds had frozen standing up. It began as light snow on a Thursday evening in early February, but by Friday morning, the world had disappeared behind a wall of white. Jeb had seen the signs, the way the horses grew restless, how the temperature dropped too fast, the peculiar color of the clouds. He'd spent the previous day preparing, bringing extra wood inside and ensuring the animals were secure, but even he hadn't expected the storm's savage intensity. We'll be fine, he assured Evelyn as the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows in their frames. House has weathered worse, she nodded, but he could see the worry in her eyes. It wasn't the storm itself that frightened her. It was the timing. They'd received word just 2 days prior that Matthew had indeed filed for custody, claiming Evelyn was an unfit mother living in an immoral situation. The hearing was set for the following month in the county seat. They'd been planning their defense, gathering character witnesses, preparing to fight. Now they were trapped, cut off from town and any help they might need. By Saturday, the snow had drifted up to the windows on the north side of the house. Jeb fought his way to the barn twice daily to tend the animals, rope tied around his waist with Evelyn anchoring the other end from the doorway. Even the short journey left him breathless and half-frozen. The horses? Evelyn asked anxiously when he returned from one such trip, ice crystals in his beard. Holding up, he said through chattering teeth. Plenty of hay still. It's the chickens I'm worried about. That night, the temperature plummeted further. They moved James's cradle next to their bed and piled on every blanket in the house. The wind found every crack in the walls, every imperfection in the construction, turning the house into a symphony of creaks and moans. Tell me about your mother, Evelyn said, trying to distract them both from the storm's fury. What do you remember? Jeb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. She was small, dark-haired like you, used to sing while she worked, hymns mostly, but sometimes songs from back east. She had a garden behind the house. Even in this soil, she could make things grow. What happened between her and your father? He happened. Jeb said simply. He wasn't always hard. Leastways, I don't think he was, but the land broke him bit by bit. Failed crops, dead cattle, debts piling up. He started drinking, started using his fists when words weren't enough. Evelyn's hand found his in the darkness. Like Samuel. Like Samuel. He agreed. She tried to make it work, stayed years longer than she should have, but that last winter, he paused, remembering. I was 7. Pa had been drinking for 3 days straight. She made my favorite dinner, rabbit stew, and he threw it against the wall because the meat was tough. Hit her when she tried to clean it up. Oh, Jeb. That night, she came to my room, sat on my bed and sang to me until I fell asleep. When I woke up, she was gone, just a note saying she loved me but couldn't stay. His voice roughened. Pa burned the note, but not before I'd memorized it. They lay in silence, listening to the storm. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice fierce with conviction. I will never leave James. Never. No matter what the courts say, no matter what Matthew threatens, I'll die first. No one's dying, Jeb said firmly, and no one's taking James. We're a family now, legal and proper. Matthew Monroe can go to hell. By Sunday afternoon, the storm had intensified to the point where they could no longer reach the barn. Jeb strung rope from the door to the woodpile, but even that short journey was treacherous. The woodbox grew emptier with alarming speed. We need to conserve, he said, banking the fire carefully. Keep one room warm instead of trying to heat the whole house. They moved everything into the main room, James's cradle, their bedding, food supplies. It felt like a fortress under siege, which, in a way, it was. Monday brought no relief. If anything, the wind grew stronger. The house shuddered under the assault, and ominous cracking sounds came from the roof. Evelyn was feeding James when they heard it, a human voice crying out above the storm's howl. They looked at each other in disbelief. Did you hear? Evelyn began. The cry came again, desperate and closer. Someone was out there. Jeb was already pulling on his coat. Keep the rope taut, he instructed. If I tug 3 times, pull hard as you can. Jeb, no, you can't see 2 feet in this. Someone needs help, he said simply, and plunged into the white void. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing breath and thought. He followed the rope to its end, then stood still, listening. The voice came again, weaker now, off to his left. He took careful steps, counting them so he could find his way back. He nearly tripped over the figure collapsed in the snow. It was a woman, her face blue with cold, clutching a bundle to her chest. For a moment, Jeb's heart stopped, remembering another woman on his porch months ago. But this wasn't Evelyn. This was a stranger, and she was dying. He gathered her up, the bundle and all, and fought his way back to the rope. 3 tugs brought Evelyn's help, and together they hauled the woman inside. Oh my God, Evelyn breathed as they laid her by the fire. She's just a girl. Indeed, the woman looked barely 18, with the pale features of Scandinavian stock. The bundle in her arms was a baby, even younger than James. Miraculously still alive, though dangerously cold. Get blankets, Jeb ordered. We need to warm them slowly. They worked together with practiced efficiency, stripping the girl's frozen outer clothes, wrapping both mother and child in warmed blankets. Evelyn heated bricks on the stove to place at their feet, while Jeb rubbed the girl's hands, trying to restore circulation. It was nearly an hour before the girl's eyes fluttered open. She looked around wildly, then began speaking rapidly in what Jeb recognized as Norwegian. It's all right, Evelyn soothed. You're safe. Safe. The girl seemed to understand the tone, if not the words. She clutched her baby tighter, tears streaming down her face. Astrid, she managed through chattering teeth. Astrid Jensen. Where were you going? Astrid? Evelyn asked gently. The girl's English was broken, but understandable. My husband, dead in storm. Wagon broke. I walked to find help. Fresh tears came. 3 days I walk. Baby, my Eric, he needs milk. Evelyn immediately went to warm some of the goat's milk they'd been giving James. The baby, Eric, was weak, but managed to take some nourishment. Meanwhile, Jeb questioned Astrid gently, piecing together her story. She and her husband had been traveling to claim land near Cedar Falls when the storm caught them. Their wagon had overturned, killing her husband and their oxen. She'd walked through the blizzard for 3 days, trying to reach help, guided only by providence or blind luck to their door. "You'll stay here," Evelyn said firmly when Astrid tried to apologize for imposing, "as long as you need." That night, as the storm continued its assault, they had 2 babies in the house and another woman who'd found shelter from more than just weather. Astrid slept fitfully on a pallet by the fire, waking often to check on Eric. "She's so young," Evelyn whispered to Jeb. "To lose everything like that." "She didn't lose everything," Jeb pointed out. "She saved her child. That's what matters." Tuesday brought a lessening of the wind, though snow still fell heavily. Jeb managed to reach the barn, finding the animals hungry but alive. The chickens hadn't been so fortunate. Half had frozen despite the shelter. When he returned, he found Evelyn and Astrid working together in the kitchen, communicating through gestures and simple words. The shared experience of motherhood transcended language barriers. "She's strong," Evelyn told him, already talking about finding work, making her own way. "In this weather? Not now, of course, but she's proud. Doesn't want charity." Jeb understood that. Pride was sometimes all people had left. "Tell her she can work for her keep, like you did. Once the storm passes, we'll figure out something permanent." Wednesday dawned eerily quiet. The wind had died completely, leaving a world transformed. Snow lay in massive drifts, reshaping the familiar landscape into something alien. The barn was buried to its roof on one side. "It'll take days to dig out," Jeb assessed, looking out at the white expanse. But they were alive. All of them. The house had held, the food would last, and they had each other. Astrid proved surprisingly helpful, revealing skills in cooking and household management that spoke of a competent past life. "Was teacher," she explained haltingly. "In old country, come here for new life with Hans." Her face fell. "Now Hans gone. You'll have a new life still," Evelyn assured her. "Different than planned, but new all the same." That evening, as they sat around the fire, 2 women, 2 babies, and 1 man who'd never expected his hermit's existence to become so full, Evelyn began to sing. It was a lullaby, soft and sweet. Astrid joined in with a harmony, her voice clear and true. "My mother sang that," Jeb said suddenly. "I'd forgotten, but she sang that exact song." Evelyn smiled at him across the room. Good songs travel far, like hope. Thursday brought the first break in the weather. The sky cleared to brilliant blue, and the temperature rose enough that icicles began forming as snow melted from the roof. Jeb spent the day digging paths to the barn and wood pile. Inside, the women had organized the household with remarkable efficiency. Astrid, it turned out, was an excellent seamstress and had already mended several items Evelyn had been meaning to get to. She'd also taught Evelyn a new way to make bread that used less flour, valuable knowledge when supplies were uncertain. She could stay, Evelyn suggested that night as they lay in their bed, the babies sleeping peacefully nearby. "We have room, she needs a home, and we could use the help, especially if—" She trailed off. "If we have to travel for the custody hearing." Jeb finished. "You're thinking she could watch James? She's wonderful with him. And it would give her purpose, income, a chance to save for her own place eventually." Jeb considered it. A month ago, he'd been a hermit. Now he was contemplating a household of 5. "Ask her," he said finally. "If she wants to stay, she's welcome." Friday morning brought visitors, Tom Morrison and several men from town, checking on outlying farms after the storm. They were shocked to find not just the Claymores safe, but also harboring another storm refugee. That's the worst blizzard in 20 years, Tom said, accepting coffee gratefully. We lost 2 people in town. Froze trying to get from house to barn. You folks are lucky. More than lucky, Jeb said, watching Evelyn help Astrid with English words while both babies napped. Blessed. Tom followed his gaze and smiled. Heard tell Matthew Monroe was making noise before the storm. Custody business. He was. Well, might interest you to know that Judge Thornberry, Margaret Thornton's cousin, will be presiding. He's a fair man, doesn't hold with taking children from good homes. Hope flickered in Jeb's chest. You're sure? Positive. Margaret made sure of it. Said to tell you she's willing to testify on your behalf. Several others, too. That storm might have done you a favor, showed the whole county what kind of folks you are, taking in anyone who needs help. After the men left, having assured them the road to town would be clear within days, Evelyn found Jeb in the barn. Tom told me the news, she said, about the judge. It's good news, he agreed, not looking up from the harness he was mending. Then why do you look worried? He set down his tools and pulled her into his arms. Because I've learned that when things go well, that's when you need to watch closest. Matthew won't give up easy. Then we'll be ready, she said firmly. All of us. That night, as if to seal new beginnings, Astrid formally accepted their offer to stay. You saved my life, she said carefully in her improving English. I work hard, help with house, with babies. We make good home together. Together, Evelyn agreed, clasping the younger woman's hand. Later, as the household settled for the night, Jeb made his rounds, checking locks and banking fires. He paused at the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. Somewhere out there, Matthew Monroe was plotting. The custody hearing loomed. Their newfound happiness remained fragile. But inside the house, his wife sang softly to their son. A young widow rebuilt her strength for the future. 2 babies slept peacefully, warm and fed and loved. His house had become a home, his solitude transformed into something richer. Don't borrow trouble, Evelyn had told him once. Take joy where you find it. Standing there in his house full of unexpected blessings, Jeb Claymore decided to do just that. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, they were all safe, all together, all home. The storm had passed. They had survived. And sometimes, in the harsh Wyoming territory of 1883, that was miracle enough. The day of the custody hearing dawned clear and cold, with a brittle March sun that offered light but no warmth. Jeb helped Evelyn into the wagon, noting how her hands trembled despite her composed expression. James, now nearly 10 months old, gurgled happily in her arms, unaware of the battle about to be fought over his future. Remember, Margaret Thornton said, riding up alongside them on her bay mare. Judge Thornberry is a fair man. He'll see through Monroe's lies. A small convoy had formed for the journey to the county seat. Tom and Adelaide Morrison drove their buggy, while Mrs. Pritchard rode with Miss Wells. Even Reverend Harper had come, though his predecessor, Reverend Blackwood, had been notably invited by the Monroe side. The whole town's turned out, Evelyn murmured, looking back at their supporters. Not the whole town, Jeb corrected gently. Just the ones who matter. They'd left Astrid at the ranch with baby Eric, though she'd wanted desperately to come. I tell Judge you good people. She'd insisted in her improving English, but they decided her testimony might complicate matters. A young widow taken in could be twisted by a clever lawyer into something unseemly. The courthouse in Cheyenne was an imposing brick building that seemed designed to intimidate. Matthew Monroe was already there, flanked by 2 lawyers in city suits and several rough-looking men who'd testified to Samuel's good character. Evelyn, Matthew called out as they entered, his voice carrying false concern. It's not too late to do the right thing. Think of what Samuel would have wanted for his son. Samuel never wanted anything for his son, Evelyn replied quietly. He died before James was even born. Inside the courtroom, Judge Thornberry presided with stern dignity. He was a man in his 60s with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything. The hearing began with Matthew's lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Cornelius Wade, painting a picture of Evelyn as an unfit mother, a woman who fled the scene of her husband's death. Wade intoned dramatically, taking with her $500 that rightfully belonged to the Monroe estate. She traveled unchaperoned across the territory, eventually taking up residence with a man known for his antisocial behavior. Objection to the characterization. Their lawyer, James Pemberton, interrupted. Pemberton was young but sharp, recommended by Margaret Thornton. Sustained. Judge Thornberry said, "Stick to facts, Mr. Wade." But Wade was just getting started. He called witness after witness, men who claimed to have seen Samuel with large sums of money before his death, others who testified to Evelyn's difficult nature during her marriage. "She was always reading," one man said, as if this were damning evidence. "Putting on airs, making Samuel feel small." "And did you ever see Mr. Samuel Monroe strike his wife?" Pemberton asked on cross-examination. The witness shifted uncomfortably. "Well, a man has to maintain order in his home. That's not what I asked. Did you see him strike her?" "Maybe once or twice, but she provoked him with her tongue." "So you're saying physical violence is acceptable if a woman speaks her mind?" "Objection!" Wade called out. "Sustained," the judge said. But Jeb noticed his eyes had sharpened with interest. The morning dragged on with more of the same. Character assassination disguised as concern for James's welfare. Then it was their turn. Pemberton called Mrs. Pritchard first. She testified to finding Evelyn at her establishment, desperate and alone, turned away because of the baby. "Any woman who'd walk through a blizzard to save her child has my respect," she said firmly. "I was wrong to turn her away, and I thank God, Mr. Claymore had more Christian charity than I did." Miss Wells spoke of Evelyn's character, her work ethic, her devotion to James. Reverend Harper testified to performing the marriage ceremony and his observations of the Claymores as a devoted couple. Then Margaret Thornton took the stand. Her presence commanded respect. A successful rancher in her own right, widow of a territorial judge. "Mrs. Claymore worked for me briefly," she said, though this was stretching the truth. Evelyn had only helped with some mending. "I found her to be honest, hard-working, and completely devoted to her child. I offered her permanent employment, but she chose to stay with Mr. Claymore because they'd fallen in love. Real love. The kind that builds strong families." "And what of the allegations that she lived improperly with Mr. Claymore before marriage?" Wade pressed. Margaret's eyes flashed. "Mr. Wade, I lived alone on my ranch for 2 years after my husband died. By your logic, I was improper every time a male ranch hand slept in the bunkhouse. Mrs. Claymore worked for room and board. Nothing more, until they chose to marry. Finally, it was Evelyn's turn. She took the stand with quiet dignity, James on her lap. The baby reached for the judge's gavel, causing a moment of levity that softened the room's tension. "Mrs. Claymore," Pemberton began gently, "tell us about your marriage to Samuel Monroe." Evelyn's voice was steady as she recounted the abuse, the fear, the isolation. Several women in the gallery wiped their eyes as she described trying to hide bruises, making excuses for black eyes. "And the $500? Pemberton asked. "There was no money," Evelyn said simply. "Samuel drank away everything we had. I left with the clothes on my back and $7 I'd hidden for emergencies. That's all." Wade's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned her morals, her motives, her fitness as a mother. Through it all, Evelyn remained calm, answering each question with quiet honesty. "Isn't it true you were planning to leave your husband?" Wade pressed. "Yes," Evelyn admitted. "I was trying to save enough to leave safely. He'd threatened to kill me if I tried. I believed him." "So you admit to plotting against your lawful husband?" "I admit to wanting to survive," Evelyn said, her voice gaining strength. "I admit to wanting my child to grow up without seeing his mother beaten. If that makes me unfit, then so be it." Jeb was called last. He testified to finding Evelyn collapsed on his porch, to her work as his housekeeper, to falling in love with her strength and devotion to her child. "Mr. Claymore," Wade said with false sympathy, "you were known as a recluse before Mrs. Monroe arrived. Some say you were not right in the head after the war. How do we know you're capable of providing a proper home?" Jeb met his gaze steadily. "I served 3 years in the Union Army, saw things that would break lesser men. Yes, I chose solitude after that, but Evelyn, Mrs. Claymore, brought life back to my home. We've built something good together. Solid, safe. And you expect us to believe this transformation happened overnight?" "No," Jeb said. "It happened one day at a time. One act of kindness at a time. That's how love works. Mr. Wade, though I suspect that's something you wouldn't understand." The judge called for a recess. In the hallway, Matthew approached them, his composure cracking. "You've bewitched him," he hissed at Evelyn. "Just like you did Samuel, but blood tells that boy deserves to be raised by real family." "I am his real family," Evelyn said firmly. "The only family that's ever loved him." When court reconvened, Judge Thornberry called one more witness, one that hadn't been on either list. Dr. Marcus Chen, the doctor from Cedar Falls. "Doctor," the judge said, "you examined James Monroe, now James Claymore, last week at my request. What did you find?" Dr. Chen, a man respected throughout the territory despite the prejudice he sometimes faced, spoke clearly. "The child is healthy, well-nourished, and shows all signs of proper development. He's alert, responsive, and clearly bonded to both his mother and stepfather. There's no medical reason to remove him from his current home." "And did you examine Mrs. Claymore?" "I did. She bears several old scars consistent with repeated physical abuse. In my professional opinion, she was lucky to escape her first marriage alive." Wade objected strenuously. But the damage was done. The judge thanked Dr. Chen and retreated to his chambers to deliberate. The wait was agony. James grew fussy, and Evelyn walked him in the hallway, humming softly. Jeb stood guard, watching Matthew and his associates cluster in angry conference. When Judge Thornberry returned, the courtroom fell silent. "This court has heard testimony regarding the custody of the minor child, James," he began. "The question before us is what arrangement serves the best interests of the child." He looked at Matthew. "Mr. Monroe, while blood relation does carry weight in these matters, it is not the only consideration. The testimony suggests that Samuel Monroe was violent toward his wife, and that this violence was known and accepted by his family." Then he turned to Evelyn. "Mrs. Claymore, questions were raised about your conduct in leaving your husband's home and subsequently living with Mr. Claymore before marriage. However, the evidence shows you fled an abusive situation to protect yourself and your unborn child, and that your relationship with Mr. Claymore began as legitimate employment." He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. "The court finds that James Claymore, and I use that name deliberately, as he has been legally adopted by Mr. Claymore through marriage, is in a safe, loving home. The petition for custody is denied." The courtroom erupted. Matthew shot to his feet, shouting about appeals and injustice, while their supporters cheered. Evelyn sagged against Jeb, tears streaming down her face. "Furthermore," Judge Thornberry continued, raising his voice over the noise, "any further harassment of the Claymore family will be met with legal consequences. This child has a home. Let him grow up in peace." Outside the courthouse, their friends gathered around them. Mrs. Pritchard was actually crying, while Margaret Thornton wore a satisfied smile. "Told you Thornberry was fair," she said. "Now let's get you home." The journey back to Cedar Falls was subdued, exhaustion replacing anxiety. James slept in his mother's arms, unaware that his future had just been secured. As they neared town, Reverend Harper began to sing a hymn of thanksgiving. Other voices joined in, until the whole convoy was singing, their voices carrying across the prairie like a promise of better days. At the ranch, Astrid was waiting on the porch, baby Eric in her arms. When she saw their faces, she burst into tears of joy. "Is good?" she asked. "James stays?" "James stays," Evelyn confirmed, hugging the younger woman. "We all stay." That night, after the babies were asleep and Astrid had retired to her room, Jeb and Evelyn sat on the porch despite the cold. The spot where she'd collapsed months ago was barely visible in the moonlight, but they both knew it was there. "It's over," Evelyn said wonderingly. "Really over." "That part is." Jeb agreed. "Now we get to the good part, the living part." She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her. "I was so scared. Even with everyone supporting us, I kept thinking, what if—" "But it didn't happen," he interrupted gently. "We're here. We're together. We won." "We did, didn't we?" She smiled up at him. "Who would have thought it? The hermit and the desperate widow. The rancher and his wife." Jeb corrected. "Parents, family." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars appear in the clear sky. Tomorrow would bring work, fences to mend, animals to tend, children to raise. There would be challenges. Certainly. Matthew might appeal. Though Pemberton doubted he'd find a sympathetic court, the ranch needed improvements. Astrid would eventually want her own home. But tonight, they were complete. A family forged not by blood but by choice, tested by fire and emerged stronger. "Jeb?" Evelyn said softly. "Thank you for opening your door that night, for giving me a chance." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Thank you for knocking, for not giving up when it would have been easier to quit." "I couldn't quit," she said. "I had James to think of, and now he has us to think of him," Jeb replied. "Always." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming spring. Soon the snow would melt, the grass would green, and new life would emerge from the dormant earth. It seemed fitting, Jeb thought, this promise of renewal after their winter of trials. "Let's go in," Evelyn said, shivering slightly. "It's getting cold." They rose together, but before entering, Evelyn paused. She knelt and touched the spot on the porch where her tears had fallen that desperate night. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether to God, fate, or the house itself, Jeb couldn't say. Then she stood, took his hand, and together they walked into their home, where warmth and love waited to embrace them. 25 years had passed since that desperate night when Evelyn Monroe collapsed on Jebediah Claymore's porch. The ranch had grown from a lonely outpost to a thriving enterprise. Its boundaries expanded through hard work and careful management. But more than the land had flourished, it had become a beacon of hope for women and children who found themselves with nowhere else to turn. Evelyn stood on that same porch, her once dark hair now silver white, watching a wagon approach in the distance. Beside her, Jeb's hair had gone gray as well, but his eyes remained the same steady blue that had given her courage all those years ago. "Another one," she said softly. He nodded, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice. "Sarah will handle it." Sarah was their daughter, born 2 years after the custody battle, the first of 4 children who had filled the house with laughter and chaos. Now grown, she had married Tom Morrison's son and lived in town, but she came out twice a week to help with what everyone simply called the work. The wagon pulled up, and a young woman climbed down, a baby in her arms and fear in her eyes. The story was always different, but always the same. Abuse escaped, promises broken, nowhere safe to go. "Mrs. Claymore?" the woman asked hesitantly. "I was told, that is, Mrs. Hutchinson in town said you might have room for one more, always." Evelyn said warmly, "Come inside. You look like you could use some hot food and a safe place to rest." As they led the woman, she gave her name as Mary Fletcher, into the house, Evelyn caught sight of their reflection in the window. When had they grown old? It seemed like yesterday she was teaching James to walk on these floors, and now he was a doctor in Denver with children of his own. The house had been expanded over the years to accommodate their growing mission. What had started as simple Christian charity had become something more, a network of ranchers' wives and townswomen who helped desperate women find their feet. Some stayed only days, others months. A few, like Astrid, had become permanent family. Astrid herself emerged from the kitchen, her blonde hair now streaked with gray, but her smile as warm as ever. Her son Eric had grown into a fine young man who helped Jeb manage the ranch, while she had become Evelyn's right hand in caring for their guests. "I make soup," she announced, her English still accented but fluent after decades of practice. "And fresh bread. You sit, rest. Baby is beautiful." As Mary Fletcher ate and slowly relaxed, telling her story in halting fragments, Evelyn found her mind drifting to all the women who had sat at this table over the years, hundreds of them, each with their own tale of sorrow and survival. There was Clara, who'd arrived with 3 children and bruises like purple flowers across her throat. She'd stayed 6 months, learned to sew from Astrid, and eventually opened a seamstress shop in California. She still wrote every Christmas. There was Little Dove, a native woman cast out by both her tribe and the white settlement where she'd tried to make a life. She'd taught them all beadwork during her stay and had eventually married a kind widower from the next county. So many stories. So many lives touched and changed. "Mama?" Evelyn turned to see her youngest, Ruth, standing in the doorway. At 16, Ruth had her mother's green eyes and her father's steady nature. "Should I prepare the blue room?" "Yes, dear, thank you." As evening fell and Mary Fletcher settled into her temporary haven with her baby, Evelyn and Jeb took their customary walk. Their path led them past the small cemetery on the hill where they'd buried those who hadn't made it, women who'd arrived too broken, too late, despite their best efforts. "Do you ever regret it?" Jeb asked suddenly. "Opening our home like this? We could have had a quieter life." Evelyn considered the question, though she knew her answer. "Every woman we help is a victory over the men who told me I was worthless. Every child we save from violence is James getting the childhood he deserved. How could I regret that? Even when it's hard? Especially when it's hard." She squeezed his arm. "Besides, you never really wanted that quiet life. You just thought you did." He chuckled. "You know me too well. Mrs. Claymore." They reached their favorite spot, a bench under the oak tree where they'd been married in a second ceremony, a proper celebration with the whole community once the custody battle was behind them. From here, they could see the entire ranch spread out before them. "James wrote," Jeb said. "He and Margaret are coming for Christmas, bringing the children." "All 3. Evelyn's face lit up. Their grandchildren were the delight of their later years. "All 3, and Sarah says she has news. Won't say what, but she was smiling. Another baby. I'd wager." Evelyn leaned against his shoulder. "This house was meant to be full of children," as if summoned by her words. They heard laughter from the house. Ruth was teaching some of the younger guests a game, their voices bright in the gathering dusk. "Your father would be shocked," Jeb mused. "His lonely son, surrounded by all this life." "He'd be wrong," Evelyn said firmly. "You were never meant to be alone. You just needed someone to show you that." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear. The early winter evening was cold, but neither moved to go inside just yet. "I've been thinking," Evelyn said eventually, "about the future. We're not getting younger, and this work, it needs to continue after we're gone. Sarah and Ruth will—" "No," Evelyn shook her head. "They'll help, but they'll have their own lives. I mean, something more formal, a proper organization, with funding and legal standing. Margaret Thornton's been talking about setting up a trust." Jeb was quiet for a long moment. "The Evelyn Claymore Foundation? The Stone Creek Ranch Sanctuary," she corrected. "For women and children in need. It's not about me. It's about what this place represents. Hope for the desperate. Just like you gave me. We gave each other," Jeb reminded her. "I was the desperate one, remember? Living like a ghost until you woke me up." A bell rang from the house, Astrid calling them for dinner. They rose, but before heading back, Evelyn paused at the bench. "Do you remember?" she asked. "That first morning? You made me porridge with berries." "Burned porridge," Jeb corrected. "You were too polite to complain." "It was the best meal I'd ever eaten," she said simply. "Because I was safe. Because someone cared enough to try." They walked back hand in hand, their steps slower than they once were, but still steady. The house glowed with lamplight, shadows moving past windows as their extended family prepared for the evening meal. At the porch steps, Evelyn stopped again, kneeling despite her protesting knees to touch that familiar spot on the wooden boards. "What are you doing?" Jeb asked, though he knew. "Thanking it," she said, tracing the dark stain that had never quite faded, no matter how many times the porch had been cleaned and sealed. "My tears marked this wood, marked this life. Every woman who's found shelter here. It started with this. Started with your courage," Jeb said, helping her stand. "With you refusing to give up. With you refusing to turn away," she countered. Inside, the dining room was full. Mary Fletcher sat with her baby, already looking less haunted. Astrid's granddaughter, for Eric had married well and given her 3, helped serve. Ruth regaled the table with a story from school. 2 other women staying with them laughed at something one of the children said. This was their legacy. Evelyn thought, not the expanded ranch or the fat cattle or the respect they'd earned in the community. It was this, a table where the lost could find themselves again, where the broken could heal, where love was offered freely without judgment or condition. As Jeb said grace, his voice still strong despite his years, Evelyn kept her eyes open, watching the faces around their table. In each woman, she saw herself as she'd been, desperate, afraid, but holding onto hope with both hands. In each child, she saw James, innocent and deserving of safety. "Amen," the table chorused, and conversation resumed. After dinner, as was their custom, someone would tell their story if they felt ready. Tonight, it was a woman named Catherine who'd been with them 2 weeks. She spoke haltingly of a husband who'd seemed kind until the wedding night, of escalating control and violence, of the night she'd finally run with nothing but her daughter and the clothes they wore. "I didn't know where else to go," she finished. "But everyone said the Claymores would help. That you understand. We do understand," Evelyn said gently. "And you're safe here for as long as you need." Later, much later, after the house had settled for the night, Evelyn and Jeb lay in their bed as they had for 25 years. The room was different now, photographs of children and grandchildren on the walls, comfortable furniture chosen together over the years, but the sense of sanctuary remained the same. "I love you," Evelyn said into the darkness, words she still spoke every night. "And I love you," Jeb replied, pulling her close. "Best thing that ever happened to me, finding you on my porch. Best thing that ever happened to me, collapsing there," she murmured against his chest. Outside, a winter wind rattled the windows, but inside, all was warm and safe, somewhere in the house. A baby cried briefly before being soothed, somewhere else. Women slept peacefully for the first time in months or years, and on the front porch, barely visible in the moonlight, an old stain on weathered wood stood testament to how a single moment of desperate courage, a woman's tears falling on a stranger's doorstep, had transformed not just 2 lives, but hundreds. The hermit and the widow had become something neither could have imagined that cold night so long ago. They had become hope itself, proof that love could grow in the harshest ground, that families could be built from the scattered pieces of broken lives, that sometimes the very thing you're running from can lead you directly to where you need to be, as sleep finally took them. Evelyn's last thought was a prayer of gratitude, for closed doors that had led to this open one, for tears that had marked not an ending but a beginning, for a taciturn rancher who'd offered shelter and found his heart, and for all the years they'd been given to pass that gift along. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new women seeking what she'd once sought. But tonight, in this house built on love and second chances, All was well. And on the porch, that old stain seemed to shimmer in the starlight, a permanent reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the darkness before an unimaginable dawn. Thank you for listening to this story of love, resilience, and hope in the Old West. Where are you enjoying this tale from? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your reflections in the comments below. Let's connect over these stories that remind us that even in the harshest times, human kindness can bloom like wildflowers on the prairie.